Hey, today I'm playing with my Switch and there is nothing you can do to prevent that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to switch up things with my channel as well, because lately we have been speaking about horrible experts, so today I wanted to review a channel that is actually proficient and they know what they are doing. So as you know, I've recently made this video, Military Rations of Roman Legionaries' Response to Taste in History with Maximus Miller. Now here's the thing, she's basically one of my regular vanilla videos with the addition of a little bit of a react to his pulse and his posca, pulse being the Roman porridge and posca being the drink that was made of a mixture of water and red vinegar that the Romans enjoyed. But the react part of this video was actually a lot smaller than the part when I actually sort of, I don't know if I want to call it a lecture because that makes me sound obnoxious, but you know what I mean, it's condescending. The usual presentation, let's call it a presentation about, you know, all the sources, military food. So if you haven't checked it out, do check it out today, but keep in mind that when I say 900 grams of wheat per month, I actually mean per day. Sorry, I misspoke. Today, I have something special, as you know, because of the title and thumbnail. Garum is a very, you know, particular topic when it comes to ancient Roman cuisine, and or lack thereof. And the thing is that I didn't want to put it as a section of that video, but I wanted a dedicated video. Who better than Max Miller when it comes to the Garum, considering I do not want to go through what the guy had to go through to make it. So today we're going to react to him. We're going to have a great time. Now the fun part. Alright, okay. Alright, I'm glad that Romans have the openings on the side. Have you ever seen this?
Have you ever asked yourself, what would happen if I left 8 pounds of fish and 1 pound of salt to sit in a jar in the sun for 2 months? Well, of course you have. Well, the answer is, you'd make garum, the fermented fish sauce of ancient Rome. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as I make true fermented garum.
It's always good to see good people getting sponsored. Grab that money, mate.
Time on Tasting History. So what exactly is garum? Well, one 7th century author, Isidore of Seville, said, "Garum is a salted liquid of fish, which formerly was made from the fish that the Greeks called gyros."
Yeah, honestly, there is one thing that does not sound appetizing to me, is garum. And if you want to say it in classical Latin, the M is nasalized. Garum.
And although it is now made from an infinite variety of fish, it retains the original name that it had at its beginning. But I feel Isidora had never actually seen the product being made, because yes, it is a salted liquid of fish, but it's how you get to that product that is so interesting.
Please.
Now, the Roman poet Marcus Manilius, he did write about the process of taking fish and salt and putting them in a terracotta vat and letting them ferment.
Can you imagine that? Like if you ask someone today, hey, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a poet. Oh, really? What do you write about? Oh, I just wrote a little thing about how you get fish and salt and let it ferment in the sun.
And then being a poet, he describes the end result in some flourishing language.
I imagine.
Their inward parts melt and issue forth as a stream of decomposition. Here a precious exudate flows out, which vomits up the flour of the gore, and mixed with salt, balances taste in the mouth.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to make. It's actually...
Oh no, that was, you know what, I have to check out the original Latin to that to see if there is maybe any nuance that we can add. But that is, yeah.
That stream of decomposition that I'm going for. And to make that, I needed to find a proper ancient recipe.
Please.
Now, 3.5 years ago, shortly after I started this channel, I did a video on garum. In fact, it's how most people found this channel. It's why I made a t-shirt that says, "You had me at garum." But it was the beginning of the pandemic and I was living in a tiny little condo, so I wasn't about to ferment a bunch of fish in my condo because I'm not that crazy. So instead, I followed a recipe for quick garum, which did come from an ancient document called Geoponica, which is a treatise on farming.
I really love this guy because he cites his sources. Like, he will tell you this is how it is because this is the source that mentions it. I really, really appreciate that.
And the Geoponica also has some more traditional ways of making garum. The Bithynians make it thus. Take preferably small or large mendole, or if none, anchovy or scad or mackerel, and put them into a baker's bowl of the kind in which dough is needed. To 1 modius of fish, knead in 6 Italian pints of salt so that it is well mixed with the fish. Put it in an earthenware vessel and leave it uncovered in the sun for 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, 6 pints of salt sounds like perfect for modern American audiences, considering, goodness gracious guys, since I moved to the US, the amount of sodium you put into everything, it's, yeah, I was gonna say mind-blowing, maybe I should say heart-blowing.
Occasionally stirring with a stick, then take the fluid, cover, and store. And that is what I am doing.
Yeah,
also, I
occasionally.
really have to thank culinary historian Sally Granger for helping me through the process and ensuring that I don't poison myself at the end of this episode.
Splendid.
So for this recipe, all you need is fish and salt, but it's the ratio that is so important. 1 modius of fish to 6 Italian pints of salt. Unfortunately, it's hard to buy fish by the modius these days, but it comes out to be an 8-to-1 ratio, or 12.5% salinity at the end of the process. And it's important to hit that because that's going to kill pretty much all of the bad bacteria.
Yeah, I was going to say, because of course we know that salt, or sal in Latin, from which the word salary comes from, salarium, because most people I think know about the etymology of that word. What's interesting is that, of course, salt is a preservative. You use it to preserve food. You can salt meat, for example, and avoid spoiling up to a certain extent, but it also does do what he's exactly saying now. It's a disinfectant at the same time, and I think that that is one of the reasons why salt was so precious in the classical antiquity, because in a time, it's not just for the taste, of course that too, but a little salt tastes better. Little salt, Americans, put a little salt, things do taste better. But in classical antiquity, it had even more value because of its preservation and disinfectant characteristics. And
what I am trying today is a homemade garum, which is good, but it's not the best. The ancients write about what is the best garum, and it was called Garum sociorum, or garum of allies, garum of friends. And it was made from all mackerel that came from southern Spain and northern Africa. Nowadays, the most prized garum is made from mackerel in the fisheries of Carthage. It is called sociorum. 1,000 sesterces are paid for 2 congi of this exquisite liquor. Hardly any other liquid other than perfumes command such a price. Marcus Apicius thought it especially desirable for mullets to be drowned in a bath of garum sociorum.
Interestingly enough, so he's of course reading Pliny. And did you notice that Pliny is now mentioning Carthage? And this kind of helps us introduce a little bit of I think, a myth buster, or debunking a myth, if you will, when it comes to Carthage and its destruction, in the sense that, of course, Pliny lived way after the complete destruction of Carthage at the end of the Second Punic War, when Scipio Africanus manages to defeat Hannibal Barca and then proceeds to invade and attack Carthage. And what's interesting is that the myth has to do with salt, which is why I'm bringing it up. So he's mentioning Carthage because Carthage was still a thing. Was Carthage attacked, conquered, plundered, razed? Absolutely. I mean, they did make them pay. They did not completely and utterly destroy it or annihilate it. Carthage was still a thing. It was conquered. And therefore, yes, any city that is plundered and conquered will sustain a certain level of both structural damage, population loss, overall impoverishing, all of that would happen, but it was not completely destroyed. And in fact, even the idea of, oh, they destroyed everything and then they salted the ground, that's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It did not happen. Imagine, even from, I can bring up the sources for that, and I will in a second, but imagine even from the perspective of the amount of salt that you would have had to waste in order to do what? The salting of Carthage is nonsense. And this is also an interesting way to see how Carthage was still a thing, even after it was conquered, regardless of the damage that it had undergone as it was conquered by Rome. Pay close attention to the momentous event that happened in 447 BC during the destruction of Carthage. What do period sources tell us? Namely, what classical author is the one that tells us about this idea of the Roman salt in the earth? Because if we say this, someone must have told us, right? Well, here's the thing. There isn't one single classical period author that tells us about the salting of the earth, not only as a sort of symbolic ritualistic measure, but also as a form of rendering the ground infertile. Not one. And yet we have a lot of accounts. Let me show you. Does Polybius tell us anything about this? No. How about the Epitones of Livy's History, book 51? There is a lot of information about Carthage. Any mention of salting of the earth? No. Now, even though some of the most important books from Diodorus were lost, the ones we have mention the siege and the destruction of Carthage, but that's all they tell us, that it was razed to the ground. Appian is the first historical source that mentions the fact that the legions were given free permission to plunder. Still no salt. Orosius tells us that a fire in the city burned for 6 days in a row. Cicero mentions the destruction of Carthage 12 times in his letters. No mention of salt. Lucan talks about the destruction of Carthage, doesn't mention salt, neither does Plutarch, neither does Cato. Does Pliny the Elder discuss the destruction of Carthage? Absolutely. What does he talk about? Well, he mourns the destruction of the libraries. No salt. And let's keep in mind that salt was very important to the Romans, and the book Naturalis Historia has an entire section dedicated to salt. But no mention of Carthage. And mind you, a lot of these period sources, well, sometimes they exaggerate a little bit when they say that Carthage was leveled or destroyed completely or burnt to the ground. Keep in mind that the ruins did remain for quite a long time, and we have proof of that. In fact, even Plutarch tells us about the fact that Marius himself sat on the ruins, so the ruins were there. It wasn't completely destroyed into nothing. It was destroyed, but sometimes they over-exaggerated a bit. Okay, but no one mentioned this idea of salting the earth of Carthage in the Roman period. Who the heck mentions it then? The earliest mention that I found is the Cambridge Ancient History in 1930 by Hallward. But guess what? It gives us 0 sources. No period sources, no bibliography. Because there are none. And from this first statement, then people started to repeat it. And when I say people, I mean Scullard, Walter, Picard, Warmington, Raven, Herm. The practice of not only adding salt as in a ritualistic way, but also adding other plant materials to a specific ground when you wanted a certain result to happen has some Semitic origins. And it was a practice that basically happened in the near Middle East, Assyria, possibly Babylon. But of course the connection to Western writers would come from the Bible, and then for some reason someone decided to mention it and it became a fact. It's not a fact, it's a myth.
And it was this Garum sociorum that the poet Martial suggested as a wonderful gift to be given during the mid-December festival of Saturnalia, which celebrated the agricultural god Saturn and included gift-giving. And he says that when you send this gift, you should include an epigram. Accept this exquisite garum made from the first blood spilt of mackerel still breathing its last. An expensive gift. Though I don't think it's very classy to tell people that it's an expensive gift when you give it. But it was an expensive gift, because Pliny said that it was 1,000 sesterces for 2 congi.
Gracious.
That's about 1 year's pay for the average Roman legionary at the time. That's a lot of money, and not everyone could afford that.
Of course.
Luckily, Martial has an epigram to be sent if you're sending less quality garum. Inferior garum. I am, I confess it, the offspring of the tunny fish of Antipolis. Had I been that of a mackerel, I should not have been sent to you. So that makes it seem that you sent this inferior garum not because you couldn't afford the garum sociorum, but rather if you had got the good garum, you would have kept it for yourself. That you don't want in this condiment. Now, most modern fish sauces have even a higher salinity, 25 to 35% in some cases. But I am going to go with the ancient Roman percentages.
Please.
Do not make this.
No.
Leave this to me. Watch and be satisfied with this. Do not make it. But if you do want to try garum, I will put links to where you can get certain modern versions of garum that are made. Definitely not poisonous. It's what I use here on the channel very often. So I'll put links to that down there. But this version, leave it to me. So first I went to my local fish market to buy the freshest fish that I could find. They didn't have the suggested mendole or scad or anchovy, but they did have mackerel, so that's what I ended up getting, 8 pounds of it, and then 1 pound of the finest Italian sea salt that I could find. Then I chopped up the fish into large pieces. What I did not do is clean the fish, gut the fish, because you want the enzymes that are in the digestive tract of the fish to be in the jar, because that's actually what's going to do a lot of the breaking down for you.
I see.
So I chopped up the fish and started to add them to the jar along with the salt. And I wanted to make sure that the salt was rubbed into each piece of fish before dropping it in. Now I'm using a glass jar because I
wonder if that rubbing is also part of the sauces specifically, I imagine.
Want to see the process as it goes, but more historical would be a terracotta jar of some sort. Once the fish and salt were added, I gave it a good plunging or two to make sure that everything was mixed together. What I did not add was any kind of liquid, so it's actually kind of hard to get it mixed together without liquid. Then I set it out in the sun, and I did cover mine because I didn't want any critters getting into it. We got raccoons. But I was opening the jar several times a day to make sure that enough oxygen was getting in, which helps to stop botulism. Now, before I said all that you needed was fish and salt, but really you also need a third ingredient, and that is time. Specifically time out in the sun. At least 2 months out in the sun. So
that is insane. I mean, imagine how courageous and brave whoever made this for the first time was, because to me it would have just looked rotten.
If you're looking for something that's not going to take 2 months, might I suggest a meal from today's sponsor, Factor.
I might actually check it out because I'm a huge fan of HelloFresh. I've been sponsored by HelloFresh on this channel before, but my wife and I have been using HelloFresh for like the last, I want to say, 5 years? We started very early in our relationship to just cook meals together. So yeah, this channel, I mean, this is the channel, HelloFresh, you want to sponsor. Absolutely. I mean, appreciate that I was sponsored too, but this, perfect.
Offer you a meal in an instant. The same cannot be said for garum because, like I said, it takes 2 months, but it is an active 2 months.
That was
the
smooth.
Day after I set the jar out, I got to mixing. And the first thing that I noticed was there was a lot more liquid.
Yeah,
it turns
the
out
salt
that
will
the
do
salt
that.
that is added by osmosis draws the liquid out of the fish's flesh, and so it became a lot easier to stir even by day 2. And every day I would go out at least once, preferably twice a day, and mix the garum. And within just 4 or 5 days, I noticed that the fish really started to break down. Fins were falling off, bones were sticking out. It was something out of a horror film. But it wasn't until a little bit later, about at the 2.5 week mark, that the fish were no longer recognizable as fish. There were still some bones, yes, but overall it was a thick brownish gray liquid that had a golden sheen of fat floating on top. Something reminiscent of a liquid that you'd see flowing out of a sewer pipe. Now, does that look nasty? Yes, it does.
You should become an ancient Roman poet.
But what was shocking was the odor, or rather lack thereof. It did smell. It had a very strong smell, but it smelled like a fish market. If you go to a fish market and you just kind of get that fish smell, that's what it smelled like.
So horrible.
Pretty much all the way through the process. I expected it to be putrid and kind of rotten smelling, but it wasn't. One of my favorite things to do all summer was to invite friends over to look at the garum and to smell it. And, you know, it was always kind of shocking that it didn't smell nearly as bad as it looked. So there were actually laws in ancient Rome that dictated that these garum factories had to be a certain distance from population centers because the smell was so bad. So I was a little worried that I was missing something.
No, I think in that case it's because it would have been not industrialized, of course. I'm not talking about mass production in the modern sense, but definitely if it's a specialized factory, imagine to multiply what you did by a factor of who knows how much, 50, 100, and then, yeah, I think the smell is going to be bad. Exactly, like imagine a marketplace that is like 50 times bigger in terms of smell. Yeah, I think that's what that would mean, not that you were doing anything wrong.
But we'll come back to that. So my summer was spent mixing garum every morning and every afternoon. I felt like the Dunkin' Donuts guy. Time to mix the garum. And every day it got a little more liquidy and a little less fish sludgy. And every day I expected the stench to hit, but it didn't until it came time to strain it. After a little over 2 months, I dipped a ladle in to pull out the brown sludge, and the moment that it came above the jar, tears welled up in my eyes.
Flames on the side of my face.
And I knew right away why there were laws about this being made away from towns. Because it was potent. Now, it didn't smell like rotten fish. It was more...
The devil.
It was like stinging, like that stinging burn in the nostrils when you smell something fermented. So I think that I knew that I had done something right.
This is I'm invested in this journey now. Is he gonna survive it?
So I soldiered on. I had put in 2 months of work and I wasn't about to give up, so I kept going. What I didn't understand was how possibly that brown-gray sludge was going to turn into the beautiful, clear, amber-colored liquid that liquamen, which is the end product that we're making, is supposed to be like. Now for the straining, the Geoponica says, a deep, close-woven basket is inserted into the center of the jar containing these fish, and the liquid flows into the basket, and so liquamen is obtained, filtered through the basket. And I suppose if you have a really close-woven basket, you could do it in one step. I'm not exactly sure how, with all the sludge and everything, but maybe, but I ended up having to do it a few times, and I tried a few different mediums. I started with just a regular mesh strainer and then graduated to several layers of cheesecloth, and it strained out most of the big pieces, and it became kind of this fish paste, which is known as alec, which they actually used culinarily as well. But the liquid that was left behind was still really cloudy, and it just didn't look like something I wanted to put in my body. So I graduated to a coffee filter, and then finally, and probably most useful, finely woven muslin. And I passed it through that a few times, and it came through painfully slow, just drops.
Right.
But what came out was indeed the clear amber-colored liquid that I was hoping to get. And while
that would be interesting because, of course, he had to use the media that he had at his disposal. So I think he did a fantastic job even to figure out which one to use, which comes clearly from his expertise. This guy's a pro. I wonder, it would be amazing to really try and recreate this with something they would have had, like in terms of what would be a sort of medium that you can use that they would have in period that would work just as well. Like he's talking about this basket, maybe trying to recreate one of these would be fantastic, but then you're gonna need some like literal specialized worker that is allowed to use and experiment with all sorts of materials, maybe know what these baskets were made of exactly. It'd be fantastic.
I strain enough to actually get a taste, let me tell you a little bit more about the history of garum.
Time for history. Nice.
So as I mentioned, I have already done a video talking about the history of garum way back when I started the channel before I had a beard. Truly, tasting history is the house that Garum built. But since then, I have found so much more new information. So while some of this may overlap with that original video, most everything is actually new information. So why garum? Why were the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks just obsessed with this fish sauce? The answer is salt. Salt was used very often as a preservative, but very rarely was it mentioned as an ingredient in food. But being human, they still loved that salty taste. As Pliny the Elder says, in innumerable seasonings it is the taste of salt that predominates, and it is looked for when we eat garum. So it was just a different, more complex way of salting your food. Even today, many Asian countries still produce fish sauce for just that reason. And not
even if it's not fish sauce, there is this little bit of an equivalent to soy sauce in a way, because sometimes it does function in Japan, for instance, as their salt really for a lot of food.
Only fish, but also soy sauce. It's the same idea. A way to add a saltiness, umami-ish, is that a word? Umami-ish flavor to your food. It's just so much more complex than just adding salt. In fact, when it comes to soy sauce, it's likely that it was used as a vegetarian alternative to a Japanese fish sauce called gyosho. It could be made with all sorts of fish, but the most prized versions were actually made from squid. And it turns out that garum too could be made with seafood other than fish. Garum could also be flavored with different herbs like oregano. There's actually a recipe attributed to Gargilius Martialis which calls for layers of salt and fish and herbs, salt and fish and herbs, though even he lived in the 3rd century, but it's likely that the recipe was altered much later because it mentions spices as well, like cinnamon and clove. And that recipe also says to let it rest for 7 days in the sun, then mix the sauce daily for 20 days. After that time, it becomes a liquid.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't surprise me. I didn't know this about the adding of oregano, but at the end of the day, oregano is still something which we use in Italy a lot. And just as a little linguistic interest, I know that Americans say oregano. In England, you say oregano, which is how I learned it because I spent my teenage years in the UK. But in Italian, we actually say oregano. So oregano oregano, oregano. That's how we say it in Italian, oregano.
And I gotta say, I don't really think that's long enough, but who knows? I haven't tried it.
You should try it.
Now,
Nice.
yet even while garum was prized, some calling it the most noble of liquors, its pungency made it for an easy punching bag for the ancient Roman authors. My favorite of his garum deriding epigrams is to his friend Flaccus. You are a man of iron, Flaccus, if you are able to make love to a woman after she has had 6 helpings of garum.
Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah, the sexual jokes are great. And by the way, they don't just happen during ancient Rome. Sexual humor, sort of double entendre and all that was also very popular during the medieval period, believe it or not, certain ancient Greece and all that. So it was always something that people enjoyed doing. But yeah, in this case, it's really, really funny. Also because we find this a lot in the authors, including historians, by the way, when they want to attack the overall character, even of politicians, including emperors, they will complain or frown upon the way they were eating, which is where we get this idea or this image that the ancient Romans were eating a lot and then throw up or vomit the food to eat again. That's something that it didn't happen with the regular population. We shouldn't imagine all Romans doing that, but it is mentioned in the sources specifically when talking about some emperors because they were wanted them to look bad, excessively lavish, and if anything, something that the average ancient Roman would have absolutely understood as being something you would frown upon. So yeah, typical. I'm going to subscribe to him now. Boom, subscribed. Do absolutely subscribe to him, check him out, leave a comment, say hi from the Metatron's community. He already left a comment into my previous video where I talked and reacted to Townsend's. Very, very nice guy. 2,750,000 subscribers. Well earned. Alright, number ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet a member of this community, become a number one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Do check out Max Miller's channel, of course, and subscribe if you like his content. And hello to Max again, and thank you so much for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.